Well, as the Russia-Ukraine war enters its fifth day, both sides are seeing casualties. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged the European Union to grant his country immediate membership to avoid further casualties. The Ukrainian leaders also said authorities would release convicts with combat experience so they could help defend their country. Well, to find out how this conflict impacts our continent of Africa, joined now by researcher on the Russia-Africa project at the Southern African Institute of International Affairs, Kayleigh Clifford. Kayleigh, good evening to you, and thank you very much indeed for your time today. During the Cold War, we saw Africa often being caught sort of in the middle between the United States and Russia, then the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Is there a risk of that happening again?
Well, we're living in a time, Stephen, where unfortunately what happens in one part of the world definitely affects the other. Russia does enjoy very close ties with a number of African countries, including South Africa. And this does create a bit of a situation for African countries economically. Certainly there will be knock-on effects, but also diplomatically. I mean, we've seen disparate reactions from different African countries. Kenya, for example, coming out very strong to say that they condemn what's happening in Russia. Their ambassador to the UN Security Council made a really poignant speech at the UN Security Council when he said that, Africa was actually in a similar situation at independence, inheriting these borders that perhaps, African countries weren't 100% happy with, but which they had to accept because the alternative is chaos. So making a really poignant point around the importance of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Some countries coming out very strong to condemn Russia's actions, but then others, including South Africa, not so much.
It's interesting to see that different countries in our continent are having different stances. In the past, we've seen moves to have, of course, the African Union to have a sort of similar stance there. At the same time, there's the non-aligned movement, which I don't think really exists anymore, but certainly during the Cold War was very, very important. Why is it that some countries in our continent are doing different things? Is it just because some of them have different relationships with Russia and its government?
Well, Russia has been seeking to increase its influence on the African continent in the last couple of years, and as I said, enjoys close bilateral ties with a number of countries. South Africa is one of them. And I think what is very particular to the Russia-Africa situation is the history between these two, the continent and with Russia. Going all the way back to, the Soviet Union days, when the Soviet Union was actually a benefactor for many liberation movements on the continent, and many, including the ANC in South Africa during the anti-apartheid struggle. And this history really does have relevance today. You'll find that there is really still that level of elite bonding between Russian officials and officials in Africa. Whether this carries down to more of a general population is not as clear, and perhaps that's why we're seeing such strong pushback from, for example, civil society in South Africa and the media. I'm calling for South Africa to play a bigger role.
Should African countries, as a rule, try and avoid being dragged into this, avoid taking a side?
Well, I think at the end of the day, these countries are looking after their own interests. For some people, it is enough that countries like South Africa have issued a statement calling for peaceful resolution of conflict. For others, they would like to see more action, but we can't forget at the end of the day that there are different interests at play here. As much as countries like South Africa can, say that they have all these principles of foreign policy like the peaceful resolution of conflict, they also have economic interests to look after, and so there are all these different dynamics at play that can really be quite complicated.
Well, the trade interests alone are fascinating. I think South Africa does around 20 times more trade. The volume of trade that we do with the United States is about 20 times greater than it is with Russia. I must just say the United States economy is much bigger than the economy with Russia. Does that trade matter?
I don't think that it matters as much as perhaps we think it does. If we look at Russia's trade with African countries, including South Africa, it's really minimal compared to some other of major powers. You mentioned the US, but the same is also true of the UK and the European Union in general. So trade, I think, of course, matters, but it's not perhaps as big a deal as some of those liberation networks that I've mentioned earlier. The other point about trade and the implications that this might have for Africa and for South Africa is, of course, when it comes to wheat. South Africa imports about 30% of its wheat from Russia and from Ukraine, and that can have knock-on effects if the price goes up. we are going to see effects here at a time when, many South Africans are really struggling to make ends meet. And so that, again, potentially has knock-on effects for food security in the country and on the continent, and that's something to be very concerned about indeed.
Kaylee Clifford, thank you, researcher at the Russia Africa project at the SA Institute of International Affairs. Well,